Welcome back, dear darlings. Today's story is my billionaire ex hired me to plan his wedding, so I legally ruined it, part 2. Until now, when my toxic ex walked into my bridal boutique and casually asked if my little business could handle his massive budget, I didn't get mad. I got a non-refundable retainer and a fountain pen. Now, he's legally locked into a wedding where the food tastes like dish soap, the venue is a freezing concrete bunker that smells like sewage, and his custom tuxedo is made of unlined, hyperallergenic wool that is currently turning his skin into a localized itchy hell. And the best part? It's all completely, beautifully, 100% within contract. Chapter 6. The Botanical Betrayal. Flowers, Chloe said, waving a hand dramatically across the mood board in her studio, or the emotional punctuation of a wedding. They tell the guests exactly how to feel. Tiffany was practically vibrating with excitement, while Julian sat rigid, keeping his arms strictly away from his sides. His skin was still recovering from the tweed-induced rash of his final suit fitting, and he looked at Chloe with the deep, exhausted suspicion of a prey animal watching a tiger. Now, Tiffany, Chloe continued, turning to the bride-to-be. You mentioned you wanted something organic, untamed, and deeply connected to nature. You didn't want standard, boring roses. Exactly, Tiffany cheered. I want it to look like an enchanted, moody forest grew inside that beautiful concrete warehouse. Say no more, Chloe smiled, pulling up a series of high-definition floral renderings. I have secured an exclusive contract with a boutique botanical forager who specializes in hyper-native, uncultivated flora. We are completely bypassing commercial greenhouses. Julian leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Those look like weeds, Chloe. Are those literally thistles? They are eryngium, Julian. See holly, Chloe corrected with a pitying smile. But more importantly, to achieve that truly authentic, untamed forest vibe, the centerpiece installations will feature a breathtaking foundation of native floor growth. Specifically, wild glaucoma heteracea and premium, responsibly harvested English ivy. Julian froze. He stared at the lush green leaves on the screen. Ivy? Like the stuff that climbs up houses? Yes. It creates a gorgeous, cascading, Victorian Gothic look, Chloe said. What Chloe knew, and what Julian was about to remember, was a highly specific detail from their sophomore year of college. They had gone camping, Julian had wandered into a thicket to commune with nature, and Chloe had spent the next 4 days rubbing calamine lotion onto his blistered, swollen legs. Julian was violently, catastrophically allergic to the entire Anacardiaceae family, and while English ivy wasn't technically poison ivy, the uncultivated, wild harvested variants her forager used were heavily cross-contaminated with urushiol traces from the woods. Furthermore, glaucoma heteracea, commonly known as ground ivy, emitted a highly pungent, sharp mint-meets-skunk odor when brushed against or stepped on. Wait, Julian stammered, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Is that safe for people to sit next to? It's completely organic, Chloe beamed. And per Section 14, Paragraph D of the contract, the planner guarantees all floral elements are 100% live, natural plants, free from artificial preservatives or chemical washes. I am honoring your commitment to a clean, chemical-free environment, Julian. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but Tiffany cut him off, clutching her hands to her chest. Oh my gosh, Julian, remember our first vacation to that cabin in Vermont? It smelled exactly like wild mint and deep woods. Chloe, this is so romantic. You're capturing our history. I try, Chloe said, meeting Julian's panicked eyes with a look of pure, unadulterated serenity. But Chloe, Julian desperately interjected, his voice straining. What about the pollen? What about people sneezing during the ceremony? I've already thought of that, Chloe replied smoothly, sliding a document across the desk. This is the layout for the reception tables. The centerpieces are designed as immersive canopy rings. They will hang directly overhead, suspended from those gorgeous industrial ceiling chains, exactly 3 feet above the guests' heads. It creates an intimate, enclosed bower effect. Julian stared at the diagram. The hanging arrangements would put the wild, unwashed, oil-rich ivy directly at face level. Every time a guest stood up to toast, sat down, or hugged someone, they would brush right against it. And every time the giant industrial space heaters kicked on like jet engines, the hot air would blow the pungent, skunk mint aroma of the ground ivy and the invisible, itchy pollen directly into Julian's face at the head table. It's a complete sensory experience, Chloe whispered, her smile dazzling. You'll feel like you're trapped. I mean, enveloped, by nature. Julian looked at the contract. He looked at Tiffany, who was practically weeping with joy at the thought of her avant-garde forest. He knew that if he complained now, he would look like a groom trying to ruin his bride's dream wedding over a hypothetical allergy, and Chloe would legally be entirely in the right because she was fulfilling Tiffany's explicit request for untamed nature. It's breathtaking, Julian choked out, his neck already beginning to itch from psychological trauma alone. Perfect, Chloe said, snapping her tablet shut with a satisfying click. The flowers are locked in. Now, we have only one major element left before the big day. Chapter 7. The Final Countdown. The night before the wedding, the air inside the obsidian foundry was thick with tension, the smell of damp concrete, and the faint, unmistakable odor of old cabbage and mint. The ground ivy centerpieces had just been hung. All right, everyone, let's take it from the top. Chloe called out, her voice amplified by a megaphone. She stood at the end of the concrete aisle, looking crisp, organized, and utterly in control. The rehearsal dinner was technically underway, but Chloe had insisted on a strict, multi-step walk-through of the ceremony processional first. Julian stood at the back of the warehouse, shivering in his linen shirt. The industrial space heaters were currently roaring at full blast, sounding like a pair of commercial Boeings prepping for takeoff. Every time the hot air blasted across the room, it rustled the hanging canopy rings of wild ivy directly above the altar, showering the stage in a fine, invisible dust of hyper-native pollen. Julian's eyes were already bloodshot. He had spent the last 2 hours subtly scratching his ankles. Now, Julian, Chloe shouted over the din of the heaters. Let's practice the groom's entrance. Per Tiffany's request for a dramatic, unforgettable arrival, we are bypassing the traditional side door entry. You will be entering from the elevated iron catwalk at the very top of the foundry. Julian looked up. High above the concrete floor, a narrow, rusted metal grating stretched across the ceiling, completely illuminated by the harsh, overhead theatrical downlights. Chloe, Julian protested, jogging down the aisle, his voice raspy. It's 40 feet in the air. And those lights are blinding. I can barely see my hands in front of my face. It's high fashion, Julian. Chloe beamed back through her megaphone. The harsh contrast highlights your silhouette. It's dramatic. Now, when the string quartet begins their performance, you will walk down the catwalk, descend the spiral iron staircase, and meet Tiffany at the altar. Speaking of the quartet, Julian's mother, an austere woman draped in diamonds, interrupted loudly. Why does the music sound like it's underwater? From the high, dripping platform across the warehouse, the Vanderbilt strings were valiantly playing a classical rendition of Pachelbel's canon. But because the concrete walls caused a massive acoustic delay, the sound bounced erratically, arriving at the altar as a chaotic, echoing mess of overlapping notes. It sounded less like a wedding and more like a horror movie soundtrack. It's an avant-garde delay, Mrs. Miller. Chloe explained with an angelic smile. It forces the guests to stay present in the moment, rather than passively listening. It's very European. Julian rubbed his face. His skin felt tight and hot. Chloe, can we just do a normal entrance? Please? Julian, look at the contract, Chloe said, instantly pulling up the digital document on her tablet and turning it toward him. Section 18, Paragraph B. The groom explicitly agrees to execute all creative staging directions provided by the planner to ensure cohesive thematic integration. You signed it. If we alter the processional map now, the venue's safety marshal will have to re-inspect the catwalk, which takes 48 hours, effectively canceling the ceremony. Julian stared at her, his chest heaving. He knew she had him dead to rights. Every single agonizing detail, the soap-tasting food, the freezing bunker, the itching suit waiting in the dressing room, the impossible website, and now this terrifying catwalk, was perfectly, legally justified by the paperwork he had casually signed just to show off his wealth. Fine, Julian hissed, his voice cracking from the pollen. Fine, I'll walk the catwalk. Excellent, Chloe cheered. Now, let's practice the pacing. Remember, you must walk very slowly to match the delayed tempo of the strings. If you walk too fast, you'll ruin the visual metaphor. As Julian begrudgingly turned to head toward the spiral staircase to practice his high-altitude walk, Tiffany came bursting out of the back room, holding a tasting plate. Julian, oh my gosh, the caterer just brought out the final test of our signature cocktail. She squealed, handing him a highball glass filled with a murky, dark green liquid. Chloe named it, the Ghost of Spring. It has an artisanal botanical extract. Julian, desperate for anything to soothe his parched, pollen-irritated throat, didn't even hesitate. He took a massive, deep gulp of the drink. The liquid hit his tongue. Instantly, his eyes shot open in sheer terror. It was a concentrated infusion of cilantro, elderberry, and a heavy dose of unrefined tonic water. It tasted like carbonated dish soap and battery acid. He immediately began to cough, his face turning a deep, vibrant shade of crimson. "Isn't it complex?" Chloe asked, stepping up beside Tiffany, looking at Julian with a gaze of pure, freezing satisfaction. "It's got a real bite to it. Just like old times." Julian clutched his throat, staring at Chloe through watering eyes. The rehearsal was a disaster, his body was on the verge of a total allergic shutdown, and the wedding was less than 12 hours away. Chloe leaned in slightly, her voice dropping below the roar of the space heaters so only Julian could hear. "Sleep well tonight, Julian," she whispered with a razor-sharp smile. "Tomorrow is going to be absolutely unforgettable." Chapter 8. The Grand Execution. The morning of the wedding, the Obsidian Foundry was a monument to chaotic precision. Chloe stood in the center of the warehouse, her clipboard held like a warrior's shield. Around her, the final pieces of her master plan were locking into place. The industrial space heaters were roaring their jet engine song, blowing a steady, warm draft that kept the hanging canopy rings of wild ivy gently swaying, steadily shaking loose their invisible, microscopic pollen into the air. At exactly 3 p.m., the rusted iron doors groaned open, and the guests began to trickle in. Chloe watched from the shadows as the city's elite arrived, dressed in high-fashion black tie, only to immediately freeze. Literally. The concrete bunker was a brisk 62 degrees, and women in sleeveless silk gowns immediately wrapped their arms around themselves, shivering. As they took their seats under the theatrical low-voltage downlights, Chloe smiled. The overhead lighting worked exactly as she knew it would, casting deep, cavernous shadows under everyone's eyes. The crowd looked less like a wedding party and more like a collection of beautiful, exhausted vampires. "It's time," Leo, her intern, whispered nervously, checking his watch. "The groom is on the catwalk." Chloe looked up. High above the floor, illuminated by a harsh, blinding spotlight, stood Julian. He looked utterly magnificent from 40 feet away, until you looked closer. Julian was wearing the 100% organic, unrefined British raw tweed tuxedo. The heavy, abrasive wool, combined with the dry heat of the roaring heaters, had turned his body into a walking furnace of itchiness. He stood completely rigid, his arms pinned stiffly to his sides, his face a tight mask of pure agony. Because of the pollen circulating in the air, his nose was bright red, and his eyes were watering so badly it looked like he was already weeping. "Cue the music," Chloe commanded. From their distant, dripping platform, the Vanderbilt strings struck up Pachelbel's canon. A second and a half later, the chaotic, overlapping echo of the music shattered against the concrete walls, washing over the guests in a disorienting, horror movie drone. "Walk, Julian," Chloe murmured under her breath. Julian took his first step onto the rusted iron grating. But walking slowly to match the lagging, delayed tempo of the strings required immense concentration and balance, two things he did not have while living in a localized skin hell. Every slow, deliberate drag of his leg caused the uncombed virgin fibers to scrape violently against his inner thighs. He flinched. His left leg twitched. To the guests below, it looked like the groom was performing a bizarre, high-altitude slow-motion limp. "Oh, look at him," Tiffany's mother whispered loudly from the front row, shivering under her mink stole. "He's so overcome with emotion he can barely walk. Or is he having a neurological event?" Julian finally reached the spiral staircase, gripping the handrail like a man surviving a shipwreck, and practically slid down to the altar. He stood at the front of the room, panting lightly, a thin sheen of sweat breaking through his makeup, which immediately made the unrefined wool collar around his neck sting like a ring of wasps. Then, the back doors opened, and Tiffany appeared. She looked radiant, floating down the aisle in her massive cloud of lace, completely oblivious to the fact that her guests were shivering, the music sounded like a broken record, and her groom looked like he was on the verge of medical combustion. As Tiffany reached the altar and took Julian's trembling, sweaty hands, the priest began the service. Right on cue, a massive gust of hot air from the eastern space heater blasted across the stage. The canopy rings of wild ground ivy rustled violently directly over Julian's head. A heavy cloud of unwashed, native botanical dust and the sharp, skunk mint aroma descended right onto his face. Julian's eyes widened, his chest heaved. "Julian," the priest mumbled over the roar of the heaters. "Do you take this woman?" Julian started, but the urushiol traces and pollen hit his respiratory system. Achoo. The sneeze echoed through the brutalist warehouse like a gunshot. Achoo, achoo, achoo. Julian sneezed 5 times in rapid succession, his entire body jerking inside the stiff, abrasive tuxedo, which only served to re-scratch every single itch on his torso. He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, but Chloe had intentionally sewn the pockets shut to maintain the sleek, undisturbed silhouette of the high-fashion tailoring. He was trapped. He was itchy. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were streaming tears. "Oh, honey, you're crying so hard." Tiffany cooed, completely misinterpreting the allergic shutdown. "I love you too." Julian looked past his bride, his blurry, tear-filled vision locking onto Chloe, who stood by the tech booth. She raised her glass of artisanal sparkling water to him, her smile a masterclass in serene, professional perfection. He had wanted a wedding people would talk about for decades. He had wanted to treat her like a small, insignificant stepping stone in his wealthy life. And now, he was bound by a binding legal contract to stand in a freezing, concrete sewage-adjacent bunker, wearing a burlap sack, starving because the food tasted like soap, suffocating on wild weeds, while his entire social circle watched him twitch and weep. "I do," Julian wheezed, his voice completely shot. "I pronounce you husband and wife," the priest declared. "You may kiss the bride." Julian leaned in, his face bright red and swollen, and gave Tiffany a quick, desperate peck before immediately turning toward the exit, desperately clawing at his organic tweed collar. As the couple walked back up the aisle to the overlapping, lagging screech of the string quartet, Chloe looked down at her digital clipboard. The wedding was executed perfectly. Not a single timeline was missed. Every specific request from the bride and groom had been met with 100% compliance. She tapped a button, sending the final invoice to Julian's bank account for immediate electronic transfer. Her phone buzzed a second later. "Transfer complete." Chloe smiled, slipped her tablet into her leather bag, and walked out the side door into the crisp, clean evening air, leaving the happy couple to enjoy their beautiful, avant-garde, and utterly unforgettable reception. Perfection, after all, was in the details. Thank you for watching, dear darlings. Don't forget to like and subscribe the channel for more such stories. We will be back soon with a new story.